That morning, she gave her life to Jesus. That morning, she was saved. Now, this morning, maybe in 2010, there were things that you held back from God. Maybe every time God started to convict your heart, you would excuse yourself, distract yourself, find some way not to deal with what God wanted to deal with in your life. This morning, do not leave here before you do business with God. In just a few minutes, we're going to have a moment of invitation. Now, that moment's for you. And there's two things that I want you to think about. The first is this. I want you to look at the life of King Saul, at what we read about him, his partial obedience, his partway following God, his selective choice. And I want you to look at your life and ask yourself this: am I fully living in obedience to Jesus Christ? Have I put to death in my life the things that God does not want to belong? And then the second thing I want you to think about is what that lady on the back row was thinking about. God was calling her to give her life to him. To be saved. This morning, do you know for sure that you would go to heaven? Do you know absolutely for a fact that you would spend eternity with God if today was the last day of your life? There was a young man that I met in a public school. We had done a drug assembly for the junior high and high school. And afterwards, he came up to me, and he started in a very shy way to share that his life was empty. That his life, what he said is, I feel like I have no purpose. And so we talked briefly there. I invited him to the revival that night. He had to go to class. It was just a few-second conversation. His name was David. And that night when church started, I looked out and I was looking for David, and David wasn't there. And 5 minutes before, David wasn't there. And 2 minutes before, David wasn't there. And I'd been praying for David. 1 minute we started, David wasn't there. As we started singing, I was on the front, and they were singing a song, and I turned back because I was still looking. Did he come? This guy that was so obviously seeking for more in life, who said, I feel so empty. I feel like there's got to be more than this. Is he here? And I looked back, and sure enough, in the middle, on the back row, there was David. Now remember, he was wearing a red cap hat, and he had a friend or two on each side of him. And that night, as I shared, I looked at David so many times, talking about how Jesus can save you, talking about how there's a salvation, how you can know for sure. Folks, you can know for sure today before you walk out those doors that you would spend eternity in heaven. You don't have to live in uncertainty. You don't have to live not knowing. You can know Jesus died to give you this assurance. And as I said those words and I'd look at David, I could tell that God was just moving in his heart. It was like he was on the edge of his seat. And then the invitation time came, and I said, now, in a moment, we're going to stand. I said, when we stand, I don't want you to wait or to fight against what God is calling you to do. I was talking right to him. I said, I just want you to come. This morning, the same for you. If God is nudging your heart and you know there's something not right in your life, if you know there's something that is out of place, this morning, get it taken care of. Don't leave here without knowing that you're right with God. Don't leave here without knowing that Jesus is your Savior. And as I said those words then, I looked back at his way, and I could tell he was fighting. We stood, I looked back, and David did not stand. He was just sitting there. He was struggling, and then he stood up, and he took his hat off, and he was standing like this. He put his hands up, and he grabbed his hair, and he was pulling his hair. I thought, this is a strange sight. He was so fighting against God. He was at the back pulling his hair. He sat down, and I saw him put his head on the pew in front of him, and he grabbed and he gripped that pew. And even from the front, I could see his white knuckles as he gripped it, and he stood back up, and he was so fighting God calling him. And finally, we came to the end. I said, this is it, last verse. He didn't come. And at the end, I said, if you should have come, but you didn't, when we're finished, come. It just broke my heart, the thought that he would leave not being right with God, not going to heaven, not knowing that Jesus was his Savior. And David walked halfway down an aisle as everybody was leaving, and he was doing this. He would walk forward. He'd stop, clench his fists. He'd walk back. He'd walk forward. He'd stop. He'd walk back. He'd walk forward. He'd walk back. I watched him about 30 seconds. Back, forth, back, forth, back, forth. I finally said, David? He stopped. Do you want to talk? Yes, please. He came down, sat down with the pastor. That day, David gave his life to Jesus. This morning, in your heart, stop going back and forth. Stop going back and forth. Today, if you do not have Jesus as your Lord and Savior, there is no heaven waiting for you. Do not go back without the knowledge and the assurance that you will spend eternity with Him forever. This morning, if you are a believer and you know for sure that Jesus is your Lord and Savior, then stop going back and forth with sin. When Jesus called Lazarus out of the grave, He said, Lazarus, come forth. He called him back to life. Physically, he had a new life. He walked out. He was wrapped in grave clothes. And Jesus looked and said, unbind him and let him go. But there are some of you here this morning, Jesus has called you back to life, a spiritual life, a real life, a new beginning, and yet you're continuing to live in the filth of sin and the death of grave clothes. And Jesus says, unbind him, let him go, come and get right with God today. This morning, the first Sunday of 2011, it's time no longer to follow God on Sunday morning and not the rest of the week. It's time no longer to come before God with sacrifices but not obedience. It's time no longer to come before God and to stop part way because that last little bit is mine and God, you cannot have it. It's time today to come fully and wholly and completely before God and to fully surrender everything in your life, every thought, every penny, every ounce, every moment of every day, and you will never regret it because until you do that, you do not understand what it is to walk in life. Maybe you're standing with a new life, but sin still bound about you like the dead grave clothes Lazarus had on. Today, let Jesus take those away and be free. I want you to bow your heads and close your eyes with me. With your heads bowed and your eyes closed, I've said all that I need to say. Two questions that I have. Question number one, do you know for a fact, absolutely for sure, that there is nothing in your life that displeases God? We've talked about sin. We've talked about going part way, partial obedience, selective. This morning, let's stop talking. It's time to start doing. This morning, if there's sin in your life, do not leave with it. Do not go out with dead grave clothes wrapped about you. Do not go out with a python that you've toyed with your whole life wrapped around your neck. It's time to come to Jesus and to let Him remove your sin. This morning, if you are not sure that you're going to heaven, if you don't know for a fact that you would spend eternity with God, if something were to happen to you today, don't leave here before you get a chance to talk to somebody like David did, like the woman in Duncan did, so you can have the chance today to surrender your life to Jesus Christ and receive Him as your Lord, to believe in Him, to trust in Him, to let Him be the Savior of your life. With your heads bowed and your eyes closed, I'm going to pray and then we're going to stand. And if God is moving in your heart, don't wait. As soon as we stand, you come.